Gas station in Columbus County received a violation notice after inspectors say they found contaminated gas in one of the tanks.
We're talking about the BP Minuteman station on Highway 7476 in Delco. WECT's Daniela Hankey is following this story for us tonight. Daniela, you learned contaminated gas can be dangerous if it gets into your vehicle.
Yes, Fran, it can also lead to your car stuttering, and depending on the amount of contaminated gas, it can even cause your car to stall or shut down. That's exactly what happened to one customer who bought gas at the station in Delco. An official with the NC Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services told me that a customer called them saying his truck had broke down. An inspector found one of the station's 2 storage tanks had the contaminated gas and issued a notice of violation. They also shut down pumps 1 through 4. The contaminated gas was a mixture of ethanol and water. It formed when that ethanol-enriched gasoline is exposed to a higher concentration of water. So if you bought gas from the station, specifically at those pumps 1 through 4, between April 7th and the 10th, there are some things you need to keep in mind when it does come to your car.
It depends on how much you purchased, how much good fuel you had already in your tank at the time, but you could notice that your car is stuttering, lack of power. In some cases, it can just completely break down.
Now, as of this afternoon, the inspectors retested those pumps and have found no evidence of contaminated gas. Those pumps are open again tonight. If you have any concerns, you can reach out to the NC Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. We have all that information inside this story on your WECT app. Daniela Hankey, WECT News.